Good evening. Good evening for everybody in Central Africa, in the Central Africa region, and including South Africa, where I find myself. I'm Christi van Westhuizen, and I want to welcome you here for the first of our international book launch events. This is of the, I'm sure you know, the Routledge International Handbook of Critical Studies in Whiteness, that I am co-editor with Shona Hunter, who's here with me this evening. Shona, do you want to say a few words?
Yes, it's lovely to see you all. Welcome. Am I starting the official welcome, Christi? We're moving in. Okay, so yeah, lovely. It's just lovely to see those of you that are here. I can't see everybody, but I think we've got a really great crowd this evening from all over the place. So that's really nice. Thanks for being with us. We'll talk about kind of the volume and that sort of stuff in a moment. So I'm Shona Hunter. As Christi says, I'm here in England, where it's also dark. We're just kind of early evening. So I just wanted to do some very brief housekeeping before we start. So you've all already understood that you'll be being recorded, you know, that the event anyway is being recorded. So just be aware of that if you're not keen to be on camera and that sort of thing. So we're going to talk about questions and stuff like that in a moment and how you can do that. So if you can all keep your cameras, the usual kind of Zoom things, cameras and microphones off, except for when you're asking your questions, if you want to do that, you know, verbally. So questions will be taken in the chat and live, and we'll frame kind of how we're going to start in terms of speakers and questions in a moment. So you can definitely post questions during the discussion at any kind of point. So during the points at which speakers are kind of presenting, also during questions when people are answering, and then hopefully if we end up with some more expansive chat. So feel really free to do that. We won't collect them up until those specific points of discussion, but if things occur to you as people are talking, pop that in the chat, because that's always a good way to get things going. So in terms of discussion, and then just also we ask, you know, we don't want to overladen this, but the issues that we're thinking about obviously relate to power and the dynamics of that and how that works. So, you know, just please, we want people to be mindful when we're in discussion with one another to kind of just be respectful, no matter how much we might vehemently disagree or indeed want to hug one another, I suppose, because we agree. Yeah, so I think that's it for housekeeping. Am I right, Christi?
Yes, sounds good.
Okay, so yeah, just welcome really to the discussion for the handbook, the Routledge International Handbook in Critical Whiteness Studies. So I think without further ado, I'll just give you a bit of a sense of the running order also. So we have basically done the welcome and introductions. I'm just going to do a bit of a background framing kind of my approach to the handbook. And I suppose more really about my approach to this issue of whiteness. So a bit of a welcome there. Christi will do the same from her point of view. We won't take too long. We'll take, you know, 10, 15 minutes each. And then we'll move straight into some of the authors who are with us this evening. So that's the authors from initially, anyway, in the first part of our discussion, the section of the handbook which looks at Onto-Epistemologies. So that's the section that that I kind of lead edited. We divvied up the handbook. Christi and I, so we've both kind of obviously read and engaged with the whole text and thought about the whole text together, but we led on different parts that spoke to some of our kind of key interests, I suppose. So the way we've divvied up the running of these events and these conversations is to reflect kind of that division of labour, if that's the right way to put it. I don't know whether it is, Christi. So yeah, so when I am involved in the editing kind of part of that book. Christi will be chairing and vice versa. And you, I'm sure, will get to learn that Christi is a lot better at being contained, or maybe containing me, I don't know, than is my kind of habit. So yeah, I suppose I need to kick off. I didn't really think about how this would feel, actually.
So maybe we should say who we have in the room with us. We're very happy that a number of our authors have joined us. And in the first section, when we're discussing Onto-Epistemologies, we will have Sherene, Razack, Katalin Halasz, and Arun Saldanha with us, talking about their chapters. And then we'll obviously invite questions from our audience. And then in my section on ideological conspiracies, we'll have Sitara Thobani and Kendra Marston. And they are literally joining us from across the globe. So I think we've got about 5 time zones represented here today at least. So yeah, very, very happy to have everybody here and looking forward to a vibrant conversation with our authors and with our audience.
Lovely. Thanks, Christi. Okay, yeah, so I'm going to do my best to kind of frame what feel like quite scattered engagements actually at the moment with what we've been doing and where we are. Oh, actually, sorry, before we move on, can I just do this very brief recognition of the industrial action actually that's going on in England in the current context at the moment. I want to frame that because it is a very significant industrial action. It's going on across 68 university institutions in the English context at the moment. It relates to pay, equal pay issues, conditions, working hours, precarity and casualisation. My institution actually isn't involved in that action. I feel quite ambivalent about that. I mean, Christi and I did talk about this when we found out the dates for the action last week. I am a member of the union, and so that's partly why I'm wanting to mention this tonight, also in order to raise kind of knowledge around that industrial action. We decided that we would kind of carry on, because I'm not directly involved in that action, but also I think because we wanted to recognise that this volume and the work we've done is a global volume. I mean, I think we could, you never know, we might end up at some point having a discussion about the globality of industrial actions or of collective action anyway. But I just wanted to make sure that I had mentioned that, recognised it. Some of our authors, the authors that are here tonight, aren't participating obviously, but some of our authors are, and so I'm also mentioning it, you know, just to kind of recognise that. Okay, so sorry. That slipped my mind after mentioning it. Right, now I'm going to do I've lost how many minutes? 3 minutes, Christi, is that right? How many have I got? Yeah, I've got 3 minutes left. No. Okay then. So yeah, I've already talked a little bit to the authors prior to us kind of all joining one another now about how editing the volume has felt actually. And I wanted to recognise really from my point of view, in inverted commas, the smoothness of the experience, I suppose. It's a very large volume. It involves a lot of people from all sorts of different national contexts. And it's the first piece of big academic work that I've ever submitted on time, apart from my PhD. So I think that speaks to something about the energy around the volume and where we are now. So this is really another thank you from the kind of point of beginnings, really, to all of the contributors to the volume. I've loved working with Christi, that's been great. Yeah, and I suppose the other thing about the volume and why I've enjoyed it so much and enjoyed being part of it so much is that I guess my orientation to academic work really is about wanting to think more deeply as a way of being challenged myself, and that's kind of the point of view that I'm going to come from in this little background. bit for you. But I think that editing books, you know, depending on which national context you're in, that gets a varied kind of press. But I think editing books, for me, as somebody who loves to write, but who also loves to, and who perceives her writing as a relational kind of engagement with the world, yeah, this has been a fabulous, fabulous way to kind of extend my thinking and extend my kind of engagement and be challenged in relation to the work. So yeah, I wanted to say a couple of things then just at the outset, that I'm really proud of what we've produced together. It does a lot of what I think I fantasized about when I was making up my mind to kind of work on the proposal that Routledge invited and that Christi and I have been working on since 2018. So I'm never quick, and I'm now realizing that's 5 years. So it's quite a long time. But I think the volume's expansive, it's dynamic, it's got voices of contention and complement. And I think it does bring a fresh take on what's to be engaged with in a critical consideration of whiteness. So many positionalities, institutionally, globally, in terms of our relationship to racializations, coloniality, all of that sort of stuff. So really, really rich to produce a very interesting set of conversations, I hope, through the volume. So I think I fantasized then about creating a book that I wanted to read, that I would learn from and be in conversation with myself through for a long kind of time to come. So, and maybe that's what all editors fantasize about, so I don't know. Having said all of that, I've got a complicated relationship to being understood as somebody who does work on whiteness specifically. This probably sounds ridiculous to most of you, or many of you, particularly given my role as an editor of the Handbook. But I think this relates also to the sorts of fantasies and desires that were left unfulfilled for me through the production of the great text, you know, that we've all kind of produced together, whether we love it, loathe it, whatever, it has a greatness for me. But there are always, you know, we've always got wishes that remain unfulfilled. And I think for me, these relate centrally still to the key problematics that I find myself in when I'm engaging around issues of whiteness. So I'm sure we'll be talking about this stuff, but in particular, I think the key challenge for me still, given the popular interest in whiteness now, or at least the popular kind of public openness of aspects of the conversation around whiteness. And I should be very specific here. You know, I'm talking from the English context, right? So, and I understand that positioning as highly, highly specific. And I'm sure that will come out possibly actually in what Christi's going to talk about in a moment. But those continuing kind of challenges really are around whiteness as an enactment of power, but as an enactment of power that has material, symbolic and affective dimensions, however we understand those, right? And I'm not pretending there aren't varieties of position, and we'll hear about a number of those in not too long a moment. But whiteness I see as a product of the fight between those different spheres, if that's the right way to talk about it. So whiteness is achieved through the use of the symbolic in an attempt to control the uncertainties produced through human materialities and vulnerabilities by way of the expunging of affect. If I had to say in a nutshell what kind of conundrums we're dealing with, I think it's the relationship between those things. So the expunging of affect is the expunging of the experience of being a feeling mind body. And I think for me, really, we struggle still to understand the relations, to hold those relations together and understand the relationships between them as the means through which whiteness achieves domination, at least, well, Okay, partial domination, or maybe we can discuss that. Not very well put. But so the separation of those spheres for me are absolutely fundamental to racialization, to coloniality, and to whiteness itself. So the swinging type analysis that we see between it's all about white people, you know, the problematics of whiteness is that it's all about white people. It brings whiteness to the fore, and that's why it's problematic. So it re-racializes or reproduces a black-white dynamic in a particular way, which of course is part of what we're speaking against. And the vacillation between this speaking about whiteness and white people is a kind of violent form, and that's maybe very specific to my ways of understanding whiteness, but as a violent form of distraction to systemic analysis. So I think we swing between those two poles when we're having these discussions, and trying to understand what is going on when we think about the relationship between whiteness and racialization. And what we fail to do is to bring together these kind of different spheres of analysis. So Christi, how am I doing? 4 minutes have I got in my brain? That's what I'm going with.
Yeah, you're at about 4 minutes, yes.
Brilliant. Okay, so so what brought me to whiteness and to having an interest in that was having this broader interest in power and in the relationship between personal power and institutional power. So my scholarship didn't start off with whiteness. It started off with this kind of nagging, what the heck's going on in institutions, in institutional life. And trying to understand the tensions that I was witnessing in the lives of people making up institutional spaces, whether they be formalized, informal. I mean, my own kind of work tends to be within the policy sphere, the sphere of formal politics and formal institutional spaces, but I also work in other kind of contexts. And so really trying to understand the tensions of how people are living through those institutional spaces and the power dynamics within them was part of what brought me to this conundrum, or the conundrums of whiteness, if you like. So I had a keen sense of categories of power, of structures, of institutions, developing a keen sense of lived experience in institutional spaces. This is kind of, you know, late teens, early 20s. But I was struggling really for a language to understand the fractures of my own experience and of the experiences of family, colleagues, fellow travellers inside and outside institutional spaces. So near Malpaul, I might say bodies out of place, but in a different, but I think related sense. So the academic language then of race and racialization, and perhaps in a different sort of way, the academic language of racism, felt too abstracted for me to understand the experience of fracture that I felt, and that I saw other people around me feeling in institutional spaces, as we do when we're interested in kind of being critical of the power dynamics that we see ourselves positioned through. So I've no doubt then that that's because I'm racialized as white. So these narratives and these languages that I was learning as a social scientist, as somebody who was working in this field of policy and politics, were positioned as being about other people's experiences. So ideas of whiteness, when I was introduced to them very early, luckily, I think, I feel anyway, in my career on institutional analysis, they gave me a way of, these ideas started to give me a way into understanding my place in institutions. So as someone who can wield power for the purposes of domination, but also as somebody who is produced through the curtailed experience which happens when we're practicing domination, as somebody who's diminished rather than expanded through practices of domination. And I'm talking about domination rather than other forms of power here, because I think that whiteness, this is one of its key contentions. It is in our current moment, in our current global coloniality, a relation to domination. So these ideas and the conversations that I was getting involved in around whiteness gave me a way to start thinking about knowledges that had been hidden and denied from me, about understanding myself and my place within kind of power processes. So, so whiteness then for me skip a long way through a lot of theory, a lot of learning, and a lot of relationships, projects, travels, collaborations, all that bittersweet challenges, is about processes of institutionalization. So I'm basically still interested in whiteness as the fundamental institutionalizing process of our times. And I think this is one of the central issues that that I hope we get to through the collected works in the volume, although there are few works, I suppose, that present institutionalization and politics in quite the way that I think I'm thinking about it here. And so this is this kind of, why is this woman doing this? What is the relationship to her work? And what is she on about when she talks about these fantasies that aren't fulfilled? And I think that is partly about our fears of bringing in these multiple relations of materiality, affect, and signification practices into bear on our understanding of institutions. I'm just going to wrap up now, Christi, because I know I'm 1 minute over. So I'm basically interested in whiteness then as this fundamental institutionalizing process of our times. I think for me at the moment, this institutionalizing is the process of organizing ourselves in a way that makes us less expansively human than we could be. So in the chapter that Christi and I kind of start the volume off, we talk about this idea of rehumaning. We riff off Dimitri Erasmus's brilliant book, Race Otherwise, which I fully recommend to everybody. I'm sure many of you have engaged with it already. But part of why I love that book is Dimitri brings together these issues of kind of being and becoming human, institutionalization processes, and the processes of racial categorization, and the ways in which, for me anyway, my reading of her work is the ways in which these riff off affect, materialities and signification processes, and how we need to unpack the relationship between those things together. So I think that the separation of these spheres of life, or these aspects of ourselves, these aspects of institutions, so formal institutional processes, the affects, the bodies, the feeling people that are in them, and the signification processes, the processes of meaning that connect us all together within them and connect us to the ideas of those institutions, are what actually keeps us into what Yancey calls, and again, we talk about this in a different sort of way in our beginning chapter, into an established ontology, an established white ontology. And he engages with Baldwin, who talks about this as being both terrifying and painful. So for me, that's an ontology of Western liberal institutionalization, which is souped up through neoliberalization. So if we talk about whiteness, we have to confront the issue of institutionalization in general, because that is actually never in general. 2 sentences, Christi. And if we talk about institutions and seek to do them differently, we have to do whiteness differently. We have to talk about whiteness, sorry. If we don't, we mistake the map for the territory. And I think I'll leave it there. I was going to read you some great stuff from a brilliant scholar, Ebony Rose, but maybe I'll get to cheekily do that in another day. Yeah, so I wanted to bring those things in for us. And yeah, that's the stuff that I grapple with, that helps me, or that I'm interested in kind of bringing out through the empirical examples, the national context and all of that. So go, Christi. I'll give you 2 minutes extra.
Great. Okay. Thanks, Shona. Yes, so I'm Christi van der Westhuizen. I'm based in Kaberga, formerly known as Port Elizabeth, here in South Africa, with the Centre for the Advancement of Non-Racialism and Democracy, where I'm an associate professor and senior researcher, here based in Nelson Mandela University. And yeah, in terms of my own background, I think Shona and I share both a concern with power, with unequal power relations, and how we make sense of them, and also, and this is something that we underline in the book as well. For us, scholarship is a form of activism. We don't think these things can be placed in silos. For us, it's important to bring those concerns with justice, whether it's racial justice, social justice, gender justice, sexual justice, and so forth, to bring that into our work, into our scholarship. So in terms of my own background, I've written 2 books. The one is called White Power and the Rise and Fall of the National Party, and the other one is called Sitting Pretty, White Afrikaans Women in Post-Apartheid South Africa. And basically with white power, I was looking more at the kind of macro level at, loosely speaking, one could say, at this intersection between class and race, particularly looking at what we're, a phrase that's used often in South Africa to try and explain this confluence of racial and class inequalities in our country, which is racial capitalism. And looking at that in white power, but also realizing sort of the limitations, and with Sitting Pretty then delving more deeply to try and make sense of subject formation, actually. So making sense of how subjects are formed in relation to certain structures, but particularly really sharpening that intersectional analysis, looking at gender, sexuality, race, and class, and trying to make sense of that, particularly because my concern in my work is around Afrikaner identity, Afrikaner nationalism. Afrikaners are a group of people here in South Africa, settler class, who are, I would say, most associated with the creation of apartheid. And if we think about apartheid, it's basically a system of intensified and more minutely designed and enforced and bureaucratized colonial mechanisms of control, but also ultimately not only a system of control, but also a system of through which subject positions were actually generated. So my concern is to try and make sense of that, and particularly now that we've transitioned to a constitutional democracy in 1994, it's very much an aspirational state that we find ourselves in. We are trying to craft something else, and that's why I believe it's very important to try and make sense of where we come from. And for me, particularly, it's been important to look at the centers of power. A lot of scholarship, particularly in sociology, which is part of my work, is very much interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary, but sociology is what I have my doctoral degree in. And one finds, particularly in the South African context, quite a focus on the margins and not so much on the centers of power. And that's what I'm particularly interested in. Hence a focus on whiteness, on masculinity, on heterosexuality, middle classness, and so forth. And because I believe that it's important to see how these centers of power actually reproduce themselves. So Shona and I had some great conversations before we kicked off with the project, and particularly around some of the received wisdoms in the field of critical whiteness studies. And as we say in the book, also we come to the field as friendly critics. This is also reflected in our title. We, in a sense, we're not the handbook is not there to entrench something called critical whiteness studies and to make the ultimate declaration about critical whiteness studies. Rather, as the title reflects, the title is, as you know, it's a handbook in critical studies in whiteness. So the idea is to actually come at this object from what we hope are new and innovative angles, to actually extend the field and really open it up. One of the things that's very important for both of us is the question of bringing in the global South much more strongly in this conversation, and doing that through scholars who are situated in the global South or writing from a global South vantage point, writing from a critical position in relation to the global North. So in terms of my own work over the years, I have thought increasingly that the idea, one of the mainstays of critical whiteness studies, is this idea of whiteness as invisible. And I thought it might more be true for the settler states in the global north, but perhaps not always, not in all moments and not in all contexts. And definitely looking at South Africa, it would seem to me as though it's frequently untrue for South Africa as an unusual settler state with a numerical minority of people who are racialized as white. So in our book we write, in our chapter we write that South Africa as an exemplar of newly visibilized whiteness within global coloniality shows how whiteness has historically alternated between strategies of hypervisibilization and invisibilization of both white subjects and those subjects who are positioned as the whiteness's racial others. So in our chapter, we tackle this notion of invisibility. When we actually look at South Africa historically, one sees that it has been visibilized. Whiteness has been highly visibilized at times in quite enduring ways, which you can see in literally how it's been imprinted on the landscape through these apartheid geographies that have proven very hard to dismantle, very much still a blight on the landscape here in South Africa. And historically, through very visible signs that directed bodies to move in particular ways, to enter in particular entrances, to sit on particular benches or not sit in particular benches, to relax on certain beaches and not on other beaches, and so forth and so on. So they were massive, in that sense, it was a very much a visibilized whiteness through all of these public directives. So we analyze invisibility in relation to ignorance and innocence, and we refer to this as an invisibility, ignorance, innocence triad in the way that it's presented in critical whiteness studies. So we, of course, there have been very useful and powerful insights around whiteness as an epistemology of ignorance, and this ignorance links into invisibility. But we contend, and I want to quote again, whiteness in its settler mode was visibilized and intensely aware of its precariously constituted domination. I'm talking particularly about South Africa, partly because of its manifest injustice. But these facts of this injustice were subject to unremembering, which is quite a powerful phrase that Phumla Qola, one of our prominent Black feminist scholars here in South Africa, uses, and she describes unremembering as a calculated act of exclusion and erasure. So past racist violations of Black people and people of color's humanity are suppressed to normalize current white privilege and to preclude corrective action in the present time. So, and I've used the phrase white unknowing to actually show how in contemporary times, whiteness sort of represents itself in drawing on this invisibility, innocence, invisibility, ignorance, innocence triad to through a kind of a white unknowing, which is an active turning away to not know the justice that, or rather the injustice that's been perpetrated, and on which white privilege is founded. So whiteness is about the privilege of adopting positions of ignorance, but this also changes over time, and it depends very much on context, so very much contingent, therefore. So we see that that there are overlapping ideologies and politics that interlink with this triad of invisibility, ignorance, innocence, and in response to changing conditions of power. And in our analysis, what we're basically arguing is that liberalism and neoliberalism would typically employ this triad of invisibility, ignorance, innocence for the entrenchment of white power. But these one could say are more wily forms, ideological forms, but they are entwined and reinforced by what we, I think, generally think of as cruder forms of white power, such as those exercised by the white radical right, where violence is frequently part of the repertoire. So, if we look at Charles Mills's work on racial liberalism, for example, where you have a cultivated amnesia, as he calls it, and there you see how liberalism, I don't have the time, but he describes very powerfully how liberalism actually produces itself, its position of power also through innocence, ignorance, and so forth. Yeah, I think I've got another 3 minutes or so. Let me just see. So another point that's been important for me in my own work in terms of making sense of whiteness is to look at the internal stratification of whiteness, which also which links into the power dynamics of race as a global order. So, and here it's quite useful to try and understand whiteness in its more recent, more aggressive permutations. If we bring in the question of internal stratification, we can make more sense. And we've got a few chapters in the handbook that go there in very insightful ways, including a chapter by Nima Begum, Aurelian Mondin, and Aaron Winter, and also Ashley Matthijs, and you know, looking at basically those internal or inferiorized, well, internal stratification, but particularly looking at white subjects that are inferiorized within the power structure of whiteness. And so, if we want to try and make sense of rising global white supremacism, it's definitely quite powerful to bring in this internal stratification, to bring in the question of gender and class in relation to that, and definitely also the question of ethnicity. And I'm particularly thinking, of course, of Trumpism, I'm thinking of neo-Nazism, I'm thinking of this fascist reactionary upsurge that we are seeing. So we can definitely talk more about that. And let me just see if there's anything else that I want to Shona has actually mentioned this whole question of rehumaning, something else that's very important for us, and the question of racial solidarities. And we also make the point that that very much that it must be possible for us, drawing on the work of people like Pumla Gobodo Madikizela and Achille Mbembe and so forth, as well as Dimitri Erasmus, to actually also to work towards a future where human beings are not always and inevitably racialized. So that's something else that I would also like to put on the table. This idea of working against race, what does that mean? What does it look like? Is it a possibility? And drawing on Mbembe, and I'll quote from Mbembe. Basically, he argues for a world freed from the burden of race. And the question then that I would like to also put before us this evening is that possible? What would that look like? And yeah, I look forward to discussing further with you.
Thanks, Christi. That's great. Okay, so I'm just going to do a very brief introduction to Arun's work. So we've got Arun Saldanha, who we're going to hear from just after me. We're going in the order of the book. And then we've got Sherene Razack, Sherene H. Razack. I don't know if you're all wanting to turn your cameras on now or not, but Sherene will come next. And then we've got Katalin also, Katalin Halasz. So I'm just going to do a bit of an intro to the Epistemologies section of the book, which is really about thinking about how we wanted to re-theorize or bringing some different sorts of ideas into this conversation about whiteness and the kind of polar dynamics that are set up often in the context of social constructionist debates around the meaning of whiteness. One of the things that I probably didn't say as clearly just in that last bit as I wanted to, I was kind of coming at that very much from a personal point of view, trying to get away into the multiple different kind of quite abstracted themes that we can get into when we think about whiteness, is the way that whiteness is more than itself. Christi has really eloquently shown there that that whiteness gets us into all sorts of interesting conversations about power. And so for both of us, it's really about trying to think about how we can get into a different set of conversations around how issues of race, racialization, and global coloniality really work. And so when we were thinking about, or when I was thinking about, or Christi and I were thinking about the key kind of theoretical issues that we really wanted to frame the volume through, it was giving us different ways of thinking about how whiteness is constructed, how whiteness comes to be, how it works, how it sticks. So different ways of getting into a different set of conversations around contested meaning, the contested meanings of racialization, and how that kind of comes to be, how it gets attached to bodies, because of course it isn't about bodies necessarily, although Arun is going to give us a really interesting way of thinking about how the meanings attach to particular bodies, and then how bodies come to be understood through the relational practices of bringing race into being, I suppose. So these are the sorts of issues that we wanted to try and bring to the fore. We wanted to get beyond issues of the social construction of meaning, to think about bodies, to think about affect, to think about emotion, to think about the multiple sorts of drivers that I was talking about before. How does race get to feel like it's real? How does it get to define or feel like it defines our experiences? Or in a different sort of way, how does it hide itself from some of us some of the time? And the us there, one of the things we're trying to get at is the way that whiteness produces different sorts of relationalities within the context of a broader global colonial formation. So first, we've got kind of Arun's work, and I've got here from the introduction, and we worked on this because we had some interesting conversations about how I'd represented the kind of thematics of Arun's work. But his chapter, I said here, presents a way of understanding phenotype as a contested vehicle for racialization. So as Arun puts it succinctly, race is a cultural difference with biology as its material. So some of the issues that we were interested in bringing out in relation to thinking about how whiteness works are centrally there. And of course, the context for that chapter that I'll let Arun tell you about is important. The beginnings of kind of mercantile capitalism. Then we've got Sherene's work, which brings the issue of religion as a set of cultural practices, but also in relation to affect and how affect produces spaces, and how that also works as a vehicle for the racialization of particular groups of people, how that attaches to religion. And then we've got Katalin Halasz, who looks centrally at the body and what the body means. I don't even know whether that's necessarily the right way to put it, but what the body means in relation to racialization processes and how that relates to the visual. So again, it's about bringing together the body, how we see or don't see, and how these things relate to issues of social meaning, and how they become solidified sets of material practices which position all of us in very different relationships to violence and vulnerability. And I'm just going to mention, he's not here this evening, he's not able to be with us, Mark Schmidt, but Mark Schmidt's chapter comes at the end of that section, and Mark is looking very directly at this issue of cultural figuration and aesthetic, artistic practices and writing practices, and other forms of cultural practice. So I'm going to hand over first to Arun. Yeah, welcome. So nice to meet you, finally.
Thanks so much, Shona. Thanks, Christi, as well, for this introduction. I'm really excited to be part of this massive project. This is really amazing to have this tremendous variety of case studies and theoretical frameworks and places in the world discussed around this structure we call whiteness. And yeah, so also thanks for organizing this panel, and thanks to everyone for joining during difficult times. So I'm a geographer, and so I talk about spatiality and spaces and how populations and bodies are positioned in them. And Christi was talking about apartheid, and that is an obvious and quite stark, maybe paradigmatic example of how bodies get segregated. And that happens through law, that happens through physical barriers, that happens through rituals and through a visual economy. And the way that I've been talking about race is to highlight the fact that it's not just through these representational regimes like law, like the way that we think about bodies, the way that they are represented in maybe cinema or literature, that you have a racialized situation, because it's also the bodies themselves that gets to stick to one another, and that gets to have a particular set of feelings and set of practices that then gets represented, and then that then gets sort of codified into law. And so my project has, in a nutshell, been about re-ontologizing race, and so rematerializing the way that we think about race, and that we understand race and also experience race in our everyday, institutional environments, like Shona was talking about. And so it's much more familiar to, if you look at other power relations, sex and sexuality and gender, class, illness, then it's kind of clear that we don't want to talk just about the representations. And so but especially race has become so over-determined by the Nazi chapter in the history of Europe and history of racialization, by all of the lynchings and the segregations and the white supremacist reactions to civil rights in the US. It becomes then, it seems naive to talk then about, and very dangerous to talk about the materiality of race, because we've been trying to get away from seeing race as being sort of lodged unproblematically and transparently in the body. And so the whole social constructionist project has been to dislodge that belief in the biology of race, to dislodge the essentialist understanding that, okay, we have these bodies and we can securely position them in these categories, and also, of course, in these hierarchies. So it's completely necessary to have the social constructionist critique of an ostensible materiality to race. But on the other hand, I've been joining a general turn towards materiality. There's a whole interdisciplinary field called new materialism, and also feminist theory, which has made a long-standing turn towards the body. And sort of building on that, I've just been asking myself, okay, how about doing the same theoretical operation to race? And in this chapter, I go even one step further and say that we can find inspiration for this this rematerializing of race from none other than Nietzsche, who is of course one of the most controversial figures when it comes to thinking about race, because he became a central thinker for the Nazi ideology of race, but often forgotten way to think about Nietzsche comes from Michel Foucault's famous, otherwise influential article on Nietzsche, Genealogy, History. And so it's really the opposite of what the Nazis made of Nietzsche. Nietzsche is very much interested in sort of the impurification of race, the fact that races, so-called, are always mixed. And especially the sense of that you do not have like a secure origin of a racialized population. And so in Foucault's lectures on biopolitics, he is inspired by Nietzsche, even though he doesn't engage him explicitly. But as everyone knows who has read those lectures, it is very much about thinking about the origins of biopolitics in the context of the nationalisms and the national struggles as they were conceived within the European context. So so Nietzsche talks about forces, about bodies, about various forms of health and illness. He talks about life in general. He has a lot to say about Darwin and sort of biology more generally, about animal and animalities within the human, about the senses, not just vision, but all of the senses. And so that kind of way of talking about racialization feels dangerous, and I completely understand that it should feel dangerous because it has led to such horrors. But I do think it's important because we can get at how racialization works and comes to be, and actually thereby underscore and highlight the fact that it is so contingent. So instead of this leading to reductionism that we say and determinism that we say, okay, white people are such and such, and black people are such and such, and mixed race people are such and such, you actually highlight the fact that even on a material level, it is only contingency and it could be completely different. So that is my political project as well, sort of opening up a dialogue with, let's say, the left-leaning biologists who would agree, and sort of affirm the fact that it's contingency all the way, that it's possible to talk about physiological, ecological, technological aspects of race, and actually do that for left-wing purposes. So my chapter is about 16th century Goa, a Portuguese colony for 451 years on the west coast of India. And I was interested in the way that a particular book from 1596 by a Dutch amateur geographer, a self-taught geographer and anthropologist, you could call him, proto-geographer, proto-anthropologist, when he was there in the 1580s, working for the Portuguese states, or the bishopry, archbishopry more precisely. He amassed all of these data on Goa at the time, which was then seen as Rome of the East and a very important place for the emergence of mercantile capitalism, especially around the spice trade. And his observations about different populations there, and then I'm highlighting sort of this new materialist reading of these observations. There's a few sub aspects of racialization that I talk about. I talk about encounter, which is of course a central theme, and we talk about travel, especially sort of international, intercontinental, interracial travel. I talk about the classification of these populations. I talk about the dress and the comportments, the use of horses, or the use of jewelry, or the use of very expensive textiles. Those kinds of basic, concrete, physical, everyday things that go into racialization on top of phenotype. And for human beings, you should think about phenotype as including these accessories. It's not just racialization doesn't stop at the surface of skin. I talk about the sort of Christi mentioned internal stratifications of whiteness, and so you definitely had class hierarchies. I talk about the extreme misogyny that existed as part of the culture, the colonial culture, and then exacerbated by emerging capitalism. I talk about sexuality and sexual practices, and also drug practices, and cosmopolitanism in the sense that you had the beginnings of a sense of global whiteness, and sort of the mixture of different populations for the purposes of becoming rich and distinguishing oneself from working class people, and thereby also from locals. And then this sense of the decadence of Portuguese Goa, which was eagerly pointed out by Linshoten for a Dutch and English audience. How am I doing for time, Shona? 2 minutes, okay. So it's kind of like a historical ethnography of these everyday actions and everyday situations in a colony, it seems, I mean, it's I think it's the earliest period in the book, but I think one caveat is in place, that we shouldn't think of this as like, you know, that I'm sketching like the beginnings of whiteness, because you don't just have like, okay, this point in time in the 16th century that suddenly whiteness pops out of nowhere, because you had earlier symbolic structures and material structures in Europe which were already, you could call them proto-racists. You know, think about the Crusades, think about like the use of slaves in the Atlantic islands, you know, by the Portuguese, Madeira, Spanish, and so this is also the sort of Foucauldian and Nietzschean way of talking about. You can have like a rupture, but then there are certain forces before that rupture which also have to be taken into account, and it's not a linear story. But so when my title is Emerging Whiteness, the way that I think about emergence is thinking about the contingency, the fact that it could have been completely different. That might not have been Europe, which put itself in the middle of the world. It could, you know, could have been India or China, which had a, you know, stronger navy in the 16th century at least, and definitely more economic clout and a, you know, bigger population, etc. So whiteness.
I think you're just running out of time.
Okay, yes. So I'll end with that. It could have been very different, and race in the future will also become different.
Okay, great. Great, thank you so much. Much to talk about. Sherene, let me immediately hand over to you, and you've got 10 minutes. I think just unmute, Sherene.
I'd really like to thank you both for the privilege of being part of this extraordinary collection. It's amazing, and it was also a privilege to be edited by the two of you, because that you took such extraordinary care. So in my chapter, I talk about how white subjects consolidated their whiteness through the figure of the Muslim. In America, anti-Muslim racism is really born along currents of racial feeling and emotion that are foundational to white American life. And I can't emphasize enough this foundational aspect, because my actual example that I discuss is an example of what many will see as a kind of extremist version of whiteness. And I don't discuss in this chapter what I do elsewhere in my book, which is the liberal version of this whiteness also relies on the figure of the Muslim. So this foundational aspect to white American life, it really derives from the historical connection between whiteness, property, and Christianity that have characterized the settler project really right from the start, and that therefore brings attention to Muslims as the imagined enemies of Christendom and as racial threats to white dominance. Anti-Muslim emotions power an affective politics that is anti-immigrant, anti-Palestinian, and very protective, deeply protective of white Christian life. So I insist in this chapter that the antipathy to Islam and to Muslims, this set of feelings, has religious and racial origins that are impossible to separate. Christians come to understand their whiteness through religion, and an anti-Muslim politics is marked by white Christian aggrievement that white Christians have lost ground culturally and materially. So the example that the chapter is built around is a conflict between white evangelical parents and a school over the matter of teaching about Islam in the school curriculum. And what I illustrate in this chapter is how whiteness is mobilized through anti-Muslim racism. So we can start then with Christian Zionism, which really is key to this example. Muslims have a starring role to play in white racial fantasies when the Christian evangelical movement turns to Israel and to the eschatological scenario of the rapture. And so the emphasis on Israel has enormous impact on the forces that are mobilized in these school conflicts. In her study of the rise of Christian Zionism over the last 2 decades, Victoria Clark describes the violent Christian evangelical subject as a subject who's deeply invested in white Western superiority. And Clark devotes a chapter in her book to talking Texan, which is a phrase from the late Reverend Jerry Falwell, who used it to refer to violent retaliation against anyone who is seen to attack Christianity. So the white racial fantasy that we see in these school conflicts is actually intimately connected to land and to white property interests. Texan speakers, for example, use phrases like God's foreign policy statement or Israeli of the heart, and they make frequent reference to the coming apocalypse, quoting the biblical verse from Genesis that those who support Israel will be blessed, while those who do not will be cursed. They talk Texan. Talking Texan includes warning Israelis they must never give up their land, and that defense of the land requires combating the grand evil of Islamic fundamentalism through preemptive strikes against Muslim communities. So a passionate defender of an America without Islam, the anti-Muslim Christian subject that is featured in this school battle really defends Christianity and whiteness in an embodied, active way. Outraged and aggrieved white parents announce themselves as protecting their children from Muslim terrorists' attempts to recruit Christian children. The scenes in schools reveal the features of this very powerful Christian and anti-Muslim feeling, and they reveal especially the close relationship that such apparently religious feeling actually has to a deeply felt sense that white people must defend themselves from foreigners who are bent on displacing them and remaking their world. Very significantly, the school conflicts also reveal a network of interests of Christian right, evangelical, and Zionist organizations who circulate narratives of these local contexts nationally, depositing them in the national psyche. And so the feeling becomes consolidated that white Christian America is threatened all around and in its most vulnerable places by its historic Islamic foes. So here, let me tell you something about the conflict. This is one of the early conflicts I discuss in my work, but there are many. In the fall of 2001, and the date is significant, a teacher in Contra Costa County, Northern California, using an apparently standard instructional guide in world history that was first developed in 1991, so that's interesting, taught a unit on Islam to a 7th grade class. The pedagogy of the unit emphasized simulation, and students were encouraged to adopt roles as Muslims for 3 weeks in order to help them understand what Muslims believe. As a part of the role play, it was suggested that students adopt Muslim names, recite Muslim prayers in class, memorize a passage from the Quran, and give up something for a day in order to understand fasting during the month of Ramadan. If the timing of the event shortly after 9/11 and the role play assignments and pedagogical approach were ill-advised, to say the least, the exercise itself was modeled on a one-dimensional portrait of a medieval conservative Islam. In fact, the school manual emphasized 1610 to 1100 AD. So this emphasizes Islam's archaic foreignness. It's an Orientalist framing of Islam that became the basis for Christian resentment, although I would not argue that a less Orientalist framing wouldn't actually do the same thing. So you would think in 2001 then, the simulation exercise would guarantee attract the attention of Christian conservatives, and indeed it did do that. So 2 plaintiffs in this suit, Jonas and Tiffany Eklund and their children, objected as Christians to the simulation exercise and to what they considered a too tolerant portrayal of Islam. A federal district court in San Francisco actually found no constitutional violation in the school's practice. This decision then prompted online observers to name the judge in question as public enemy and to condemn her all round as an Al-Qaeda supporter. So you'll notice here, this is 2001, and you're seeing the trolling of judges. Ultimately, though, the Eklunds lost their case in the Supreme Court, where the decision to dismiss the suit emphasized the school district's argument that schools need to be able to address religion in the curriculum without fear of reprisal. But that the Eklunds failed in their suit does not alter the circulation of an anti-Muslim affect. Instead, what I suggest is that it sustains it. Law provides the stage on which the conflict is framed as one between normative white citizens and a foreign Muslim enemy. The script that is enacted provides the basis for a broader mobilization of whiteness from the local to the national stage. Very, very significantly, the Eklunds were not simply lone parents who disagreed with the teaching of Islam in the curriculum and who decided to challenge it in court. They were supported in their activities by the Thomas More Law Center, an organization that describes itself as a nonprofit public interest law firm. And their mission is to, and I quote, preserve America's Judeo-Christian heritage. So firmly anchored in a politics of Christian conservative values, the law firm has been involved in several lawsuits against school boards. And they are part of a concerted longer-term strategy revolving around the teaching of Islam in schools, a strategy in which other conservative Christian groups, such as Act for America, have participated for almost 2 decades. And you will see that the sort of high point, the culmination of this kind of activity about Muslims and Islam is really also there in the present sort of impulse, a campaign to ban critical race theory. So these are in the school curriculum. These are very, very organized lobbies with several enemies going at once. But in this particular case, Islam is at the center of it, and Muslims. So this kind of suit also attracted the support of organizations that are involved in gun rights cases, in the opposing environmental and indigenous rights, tearing down Christian war memorials. I think what is deeply significant of all of this is that this is a package of things that together amount to the protection of whiteness. So it requires all these different aspects, and you will see it in all kinds of cases. So the defense of America and Israel from marauding Muslims is often understood in unabashedly colonial terms. The Christian storyline is discernible, discernible in these cases, is also circulated by Middle East Forum, the think tank that is founded by Daniel Pipes, one of the most prolific of Zionist individuals, regularly publishing articles on the threat of radical Islam. So Pipes invokes the specter of the Islamic terrorists, and he wrote that the Eklund's lawsuit really confirms for all concerned that American children are being recruited for Islamic terrorism through schools. So law is the conduit through which anti-Muslim animus travels, forging whiteness as it does so, even when the suits actually fail. Mm-hmm. Deposited in the legal record and ready for transport to the national stage, the story of whiteness that is achieved through anti-Muslim racism gains ground each time it is performed, filling white Christians with the warmth of entitled belonging and righteous rage. I don't, I say a lot in this chapter as well about this warmth of entitled belonging and righteous rage, powerful emotions that are organized and circulated as an affect, and you see all kinds of anti-Muslim actors coming into the fray, Fox News, various journals, various academics, and many organizations. So quite an organized politics that flows from this.
We'll have to leave it at that for the moment.
Yes.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Sherene. And it's been a pleasure to work with you as well. So it's likewise from my side. And then we have Katalin Halasz, who will do our next input.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Many thanks to all of you for attending, and especially for Shona and Christi for organizing such an incredible lineup of talks across time zones and locations, and obviously for the amazing collection at the Handbook. So the title of my chapter is Effects in Making White Womanhood. But before I give you a brief overview of the key themes of the chapter, I want to talk a little bit about the images of the Handbook. And apart from the images in my chapter, there is a very powerful image on the front cover, which you all probably have seen already. It features on the flyer as well, and I'm just gonna quickly, just if it's not blurred, there we are. So the title of the artwork is Show and Tell 5, and it is by Norman Catherine. I asked Christi and Shona why they have chosen this particular image and what it conveys to them. Their responses were very interesting and also very different. Christi told me that Norman Catherine is a South African artist known for his anti-apartheid work and support for Black artists in South Africa. Christi bought a signed imprint of the work a few years ago, and she told me when they had to choose an image, this one immediately came to her mind because she thought it can be read as a critical interrogation of whiteness, as a subjectivity, but also as a structural position. She saw that the question of whiteness as consumption and whiteness as an unstable positionality features in the image. Shona's response to the image was much more effective. She said, and I quote, "I love its boldness, I love its provocation." At the same time, she felt ambivalent about it, as she does a lot of work that centers trauma and power together. She finds Catherine's art provocative in terms of its refusal to shy away from the violence of whiteness and its relationship to being human. But Shona very importantly also made a point about the positionality of the viewer and stated that it is easier to look at it as someone who is racialized as white. She said, and I quote again, "The visualizing of violence and the racializing iconography that I see Catherine playing with in that image re-racializes those of us looking at it." For me, the cover image expresses very strongly that we live race and the violent present and past histories of racism in which we are all relationally entangled. This image also powerfully conveys for me how we know race in our bodies, how race is lived inside our bodies. And this is also the main theme I explored in my chapter, which is based on a performance art piece that I developed to understand the interplay between racial discourses, material and social relations, and embodied practices. Put simply, how discourse and affect are mutually constitutive of racialized subjectivities. My focus in the performance is a very specific female embodiment, that of the heterosexual, able-bodied, cis white woman from the global north. I put this white female body in a studio space that I designed to resemble a classroom, a familiar white space that white people perceive as non-racial, but which gradually transform into a highly racial frame as the performance develops. I asked the performer to write one simple sentence on a blackboard. "I love black men" is the sentence that she keeps writing until there is no space left. The persistent stereotype that this sentence expresses is that of the hypersexualized black male body that locks white women, black men, and white men together in the history of white supremacy. You can see images of the performance in the chapter. These are photographic documentations, representations of the real event, which was the performance itself. The photos do not contain the unscripted sigh that the performer let out at the end of her writing of the sentence on the blackboard. I used this unscripted sigh, which was the only and deeply corporeal reaction I got from the performer, in order to develop an argument about white female embodiment and its potentiality in fracturing whiteness. My analysis takes place in an understanding of the body as a battlefield. I use George Yancey's conceptualization of black and white bodies as never fixed and at rest, but constantly fought over in moments of contemporary and past histories. Processes of symbolic iteration construct black bodies as fragmented and traumatized through distorted images projected onto it, while white bodies are created as the transcendental norm. But these meanings, norms, and assumptions of the body can be defied, fractured, and disarticulated. For Yancey, the material force of the body is interpreted through historical discourse. I developed I Love Black Men to push this argument further and show how the white female body responds effectively to racializing discourse, and to demonstrate that it is more than merely a matter to be interpreted. The battlefield that is the white female body in the performance holds the potential of its material force to intervene in dominant discourses. Images, ideas, and stereotypes are not simply inscribed onto the surface of the passively recipient white female body. They are fought over by its material life force, by its affective intensities and energies. Written in first person, the simple text of I Love Black Men is employed to make the performer enact perceptions of her race, gender, and sexuality inscribed on her body of a white woman. The performance works with visual discourse on racial and gender difference, and with the visual markers that are culturally inscribed on the body. But it does not stop there. It further explores that there is more at play here than simply the intricate ways in which power shapes the body through discourse. Social and cultural norms interact with the corporeal in a dynamic relationality. Acknowledging the work of affects allows us to conceptualize the white female body beyond the limiting focus of the external surface or appearance. In the process of writing the text, I Love Black Men becomes smudged and broken until it reads only, Men I love, men I. The end of the performance could be read as the performer's intellectual and emotional struggle to comprehend the sentence and understand its implications, to the point where racial and sexual differences are exhausted, forcing us to ask what they entail. The sigh of the performer could be a sigh of exhaustion from the process by which the discourse becomes internalized and thrown back into space. Through the sigh of affect, the body takes back her place in the discourse. The living texture and materiality of the white female body has ripped off the inscriptive surface of historical discourse. In my purposefully anti-essentialist decolonial reading of the performance and of the sigh of the performer, I see the body undergoing a process of disorientation and undoing of the various hegemonic norms that she has inherited and perpetuated. For me, the piece seeks to gradually dismantle the trope of the heterosexual white supremacist family, to refuse the racial and sexual contract of white womanhood in the service of upholding white supremacy. To end, I would like to go back to Shona's point about the positionality of the viewer and about how images and artworks that explore race and whiteness re-racialize the viewers. As I write in my chapter, engaging with the performance can have contradictory effects. One can be bored and uninterested in seeing a white woman act, or maybe curious or even enraged by yet another white woman demanding attention. But in my reading, if one is open and engaged, the devastating effects of ideologies locked in bodies can be brought close. In I Love Black Men, I envisage the formation of new and varied public bodies for white women, and the potential of performing anti-essentialist relations outside of the colonial frames of cisgendered and heterosexualized white. And here, but I would really like to hear your thoughts of the images of the handbook and welcome any further reflections on the cover image or on the performance. Thank you.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know where Christi's gone.
Yeah, Katalin, thank you so much for that. So we've had three very rich inputs. I know way too short in each case. We would have loved to have heard much more. Of course, we've got limited time, but now we do have our question and answer session. And let me just check in the chat. So people are really welcome to post questions in the chat. And we will also take live questions. So just you can use the reactions at the bottom. If you look at the tab at the bottom, you can click on reactions and raise your hand if you want to ask a live question, which we will also take. I think we've heard very rich inputs here on the ways in which whiteness perpetuates itself. Also. In forms that we may not typically associate, I think, in an everyday sense, with whiteness as a racial formation. We don't necessarily make the kinds of associations or the kinds of analyses that, for example, Sherene has shown us around how law serves as literally as a kind of a platform. And even in, I thought it was fascinating, the case study that you were talking about, where you have a case that's actually lost ultimately, so before the Supreme Court. And we know cases don't easily come before the US Supreme Court. They've got a very complicated system of vetting there. And so the fact that it actually got to the level of the Supreme Court, and it makes sense in terms of your analysis then, how law actually becomes a platform through which certain ideas around whiteness are put into circulation, and how whiteness is re-entrenched and reinforced. Actually, even if one just looks at the on the face, at this case of where in this case the case was actually lost. So where it's actually more about that putting into circulation certain ideas around whiteness, and I think you've shown very powerfully what those kinds of ideas are, and the sense of how white belonging is reinforced in the United States, and through the figure of the Muslim. Shona, do you have any questions or comments to make at this stage? We don't have anything yet from our audience.
Well, that's what I thought. I thought I'd take a bit of a privilege as I was kind of listening, and also to maybe kind of encourage other folks to just have a bit of breathing time and think into the varied kind of relationships between the pieces, because I was reminded very strongly about the very different ways that you all do two things together, but also separately in relation to rethinking temporalities, I think, in very interesting ways. So rethinking racialized temporalities, or the sorts of ways that we think about the relationships between how race has come to be and how whiteness has come to be in particular. So I really liked the emphasizing that you did, Arun, right at the beginning about this, or the end maybe of your summary, about kind of why you started where you did, and what using the sorts of ideas that you're using can get us into a different sort of conversation around whiteness as in its contemporary global colonial, you know, and how that comes in, and how it could have come in, or how other forms of coloniality could have come in to become kind of dominant, or at least to appear dominant. So I thought that was really interesting, and listening to the three of you, listening to Sherene again, the relationship between spatialities and temporalities and intimate practices. So across all of the pieces, again, spatialities, temporalities, intimate practices, and by intimate, I suppose I'm meaning the kind of intimacies in the schoolyard, or the ones that are actually being thrown up in relation to the case, Sherene, in relation to your piece. And then Katalin, it appears the intimacies that you're kind of pointing to maybe appear more obvious than in the legalities that Sherene's pointing to, but all of your pieces speak to the relationship between affect, bodies, meanings, the construction of whiteness, its contingencies, and its relationship to materialities. So that kind of that another triad that I think I was interested in prizing apart. And so I wanted to ask you all about the choice, I suppose, if it was a choice, of the particular examples, the particular timeframes and the particular locations that you talked about in the handbook. You know, how did that come about? How did those choices come about for you? And how, if they are, and I hope they are, I mean, Arun's already spoken to this a bit, but how are they important to helping us to unpack kind of these issues around whiteness and how it works?
Yeah, shall we start with Katalin first?
Yeah, so the question is about the choice of the particular time frames, you said, or the particular, because in my case it's a bit different from Sherene's and Arun's. I think I could talk about why I have chosen to work with the white cisgendered heterosexual North woman. What does the
choice of the present do, I suppose, in relation to that example is what I'm asking about. You know, you could have chosen a historical representation. So what does the locatedness, the temporal locatedness, and the location of your example do for your analysis, I suppose, is what I'm asking.
Okay. Because I think one point I'm making with my piece, and I've been thinking about it, how is the body in itself, it's like, it's not fixed in time. That we all have these histories, these living histories of the past, and how it is present in our bodies, in our everyday lives, how we relate to those histories of past that can be reenacted in a moment of like an encounter or any like an affective episode. And this is what I brought in my performance as well. We see a woman who is at that time was in her 30s, an artist, a performance artist who I used to work with, but she embodied North, white femininities from the global North, all the histories that comes with that. And what I wanted to express with that we are not just our own biographies. We do, as a white woman myself, coming from Hungary, but obviously it's part of the global North, I am also bringing myself with every encounter, every episode in my life, wherever I go and whatever I do, this kind of history, so that there is this lived time which goes back to centuries. And as Arun said, even before, I don't know, the Middle Ages. So I guess this would be my take on temporalities.
Great, thanks. Sherene?
My example is one of several, so I chose it for brevity. So but what they all are examples in the post 9/11 period of a growing, escalating anti-Muslim lobby and campaign. So the temporality is, it's a bit unfortunate that I begin with 2001, because it may convey to people that this is a problem that only emerges at 2001, rather than I'd really like to connect to Arun's point here. For these people in these school conflicts, the Crusades could have happened that afternoon. They're in a whole history that is several hundred years old, and that connect to sort of the making of the European through the figure of the Muslim, the making of the colonizer through the figure of the Muslim. So it is as though, and this is the most striking thing about all the cases that I discuss in my forthcoming book, it is as though all of these things have collapsed in both in space and in time. So that you have, Katalin, you mentioned Hungary, and I was thinking about how the present making of whiteness in Hungary through the figure of the Muslim is, yes, and with absolutely strong and direct US involvement of groups. So you're having like spaces collapsing, times collapsing on each other, and the sort of Muslim monsters in people's heads are, the descendants of those in their heads, after the Crusades. I must tell you that as a researcher, I wonder, is it my own lack of knowledge or naivete, but I was just completely struck by the way in which people actually feel the Crusades, like deeply.
Yeah. I think it's part of why I asked the question, actually, is that I don't want to prejudge your answer, Arun, actually, but it is about the I'm going to use the notion of politics now, because I can't think of a better way to do it. But that was kind of what I was trying to tease out through the particularities, right? That one of the things that struck me, that Arun, about that emphasizing that Arun did earlier on about his particular example, is because you're using it, or my reading anyway, Arun, is that you're using it in a way that actually shifts our understandings of beginnings and of the production of the contemporary global colonial kind of context that we imagine ourselves to be in. And so together, that hearing the three of you speak again, I'm kind of reminded about I'm sure you'll have a better way of talking about, but the politics of the contingent kind of examples that you are all talking about, and how that helps us to think about, from my point of view anyway, institutional presence, or the present, very differently, and it allows us to think differently about formal spaces. So anyway, sorry, Arun, I jumped in before you could answer.
No worries. I'll just add that there's a bit of on a theoretical level, a tension between historicism and structuralism. And so the danger of historicism is that you think that everything sort of can be explained by what came before. And the danger of structuralism would be that everything seems to be sort of neatly contained in a kind of a structure which doesn't change. So, Orientalism, for example, does have, the historian will say, well, we can talk about like how it emerged and what contestations were there. And the structuralist, and I think one of the best examples in the theoretical present is Afro-pessimism. I think it has a very, very strong argument, but it's a very structuralist argument. And so, so I was thinking about this tension, and I also see a lot of interesting interactions between the three chapters around apocalypticism and the end and decadence, in the context of Israel, in the context of Trumpism. There is more and more the sense that whiteness is dying, and the reactions to that are going to be violent. And as you have, I don't want to sound too gloomy, but as you have other regions in the world becoming more powerful, I'm not sure how that's going to play out in terms of ideology and the way that identities are conceived of and constituted. But that's going to be something that, what is whiteness going to look like 100 years from now, when it's China and it's the Middle East, which might, or maybe Brazil or East Asia, which are going to be more powerful in economic and also military terms. And yes, also the art piece that Katalin was talking about, that there is a sort of like obsessiveness to it, and a way that there's a sort of overture towards blackness, and she's in the performance, she's refusing the sort of biopolitical reproduction of whiteness, and of course that is a huge area of biopolitical concern, miscegenation, sort of the
Christi, I'll stop talking. There's a question there.
Yes, I see we have a question. Thank you for that, Arun and Sherene and Katalin. This is a question from Carla Mostert here in South Africa, asking Katalin, I'm wondering if you could share how audiences have reacted to the performance. Were there reactions that surprised you? Any reflections on the reactions? Also, as a comment on interracial relationships between white women and black men. That also links to what Arun was saying now, this kind of race traitorship of white women who refuse their kind of nationalist and so forth duty in terms of interacting with black men sexually and so. So, Katalin, do you want to answer that? And in fact, there's another one from Victoria Berger. How do you respond to criticism about centering whiteness in work about racialization? In fact, yeah, I think let's go for that. Katalin, over to you.
Yeah, so I did not mention in my presentation, but I do in the writing in the chapter itself that there were no audiences, so I'm sorry to disappoint there. It was basically, this performance piece was not meant to be for audiences. It was only for research purposes, for me to understand. It was part of my doctoral project, and I was just enmeshed with all these ideas about social constructionism and whiteness and power, but I felt that something is missing, and I just wanted to test all this concept that I learned about and I studied about. Okay, so what happens when I put a white female body, which was naked, in a studio, which was my studio I just rented with a friend of mine. So there were no audiences. It wasn't meant to be on stage for audiences. It was just for me to understand what's going on, actually. So in that way, there were no reactions. But when I write about this performance, or when I show the video of this performance to different audiences, then I do get sometimes this question that Victoria has asked me about centering whiteness. But I think it's a question for us all as scholars who do work on whiteness, and how to, I don't remember from whom was that quote, but, or maybe it was Richard Dyer, of course, who said that he's afraid that, that this paranoia of whiteness studies themselves, of working on whiteness from a critical perspective, but then being afraid that we are just recentering whiteness through our work. But I think, so I do get that question. And but I also talked a little bit in my presentation, going back to Shona, who made this point about that everybody who perceives an artwork has their own interpretation, of course. And these works that work on race and whiteness in particular does this work of racializing us, the viewer. So without contextualization, I don't show the work anymore. I have done this, that I just put it out there. And then I got a lot of very, very critical voices, which were very important for me to also understand how I can put out a work like this as a critical intervention into how whiteness works and how visual practices and social construct and ideologies work on the body. So I never show it without my interpretation of it, which is obviously open to everybody to engage with my interpretation and have critical comments as well about it. So this would be my answers.
Thank you. Sherene, from my side, can you talk a little bit more about this notion of emotion as this intersubjective process? And I'm particularly interested just in the idea of how white belonging becomes constructed, against people who are objectified as other, and how whiteness is then constructed. Because I think there's been amazing work done in the area of affect. And this is particularly powerful in terms of making sense of also of how whiteness reproduces itself and how it, the formations that it's able to create, particularly mobilizing affect.
Yes, thanks for that. In the chapter, I give the example from Du Bois about him noticing that white people can't get through the day without feeling these incredible rages. And he gives examples of, a white man passing by, sees a 12-year-old black child sitting in the wrong place and descends into this terrible rage. And this is, there's an everydayness about these things that he's noticing. And I think that for me really sort of is key to understanding this white subject. The white subject that I'm talking about is a very anxiety-ridden, conflicted, unstable white subject, triggered in a minute by anything. And this is totally frightening. I'm thinking of an example in another part of my work where a white woman explains that, her daughter came home with a homework assignment, and the homework assignment is to draw Arabic calligraphy. It's an art class. And the white woman says, I got a terrible feeling when I saw the Arabic. It was a terrible feeling. And she goes on to sort of explain that she felt it was the devil himself, that this was such a terrible thing that one would have to gaze on and draw Arabic. And I want to take that, even though that woman is an example of the kind of networked, cases that are proceeding. So there are lots of people circulating her words and turning it into law cases and late night shows and so on. I want to take her at her word, and I want to think about that person who is unhinged at seeing Arabic. That is an extraordinary thing, and it really reveals something very critical about race, that racialization is the process of sort of people making themselves over and over again 1,000 times a day through this encounter and having these rages, and then through these rages actually managing to feel comfort and warmth and security in being white. And clearly being white is a highly unstable thing, where you have to reassure yourself a lot. And the way that you reassure yourself For example, and Katalin's example made me think about it. You have to reassure yourself that you don't desire blackness, that you don't want to come close to it, that you know that there should be a big wall between you and it. That takes like so much energy. And in my work, the bottom line is the only way you're really going to do this, to convince yourself that you are safely white, is through violence against the racial other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's that the dream of what the pure otherless universe that the white subject clings onto, and that kind of deep feeling of affront that universe is now being disturbed by. Very, very powerful work. That I also want to ask Arun just about you were talking about. That it's not just skin deep whiteness, or you were talking about skin and what's on the skin, but you were also talking about the role of or the functionality of objects in relation to whiteness, and how objects become, in a sense, also then stand in for whiteness. Talk a little bit more about that, because I think that's. Also, what's really fascinating in your chapter is how you illuminate that whole relationship.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and so there's consumption patterns. There's entire houses and cars, of course, guns, gun ownership, and so all of these can be linked to. I mean, there's that famous pamphlet in 1967, "Negroes with Guns," and so that title really captured the extent to which, in the imagination of the U.S., the white supremacist sort of structure of feeling, guns were something connected to white bodies, and only white bodies had the rights to own guns, to defend their property, and to reinstate their position, like Sherene says, through sort of violence or potential violence, and then to have Black people with guns, and then very soon the Black Panther Party, that upsets that, of course, tremendously. And so that's one example of how an object can be a sort of prosthetic to a body, but then, all of the literature, like Marshall McLuhan, about media being sort of extensions of the body, it's helpful to read that through a critical race lens and see those sorts of things as also essential. We can't think of human beings as not extended to these objects, whether it's capitalist society or any other kinds of society. But you have these patterns of consumption and patterns of living and moving around, which further reinforce the distinction between populations. And so makeup, certain kinds of dress. In the context of my chapter, there's also the use of the palanquin, which is basically domestic slaves carrying someone around in this box. And so not a horse-drawn carriage, but a human-drawn box. And especially for women, that was important, because if we have to believe the accounts of the time, the Portuguese nobility and the white people in Goa were extremely jealous of their wives. And yes, if we talk about embodiment, I think those sorts of extensions of the body, again, highly contingent, because at some point you can have extensions which are the pickup truck is a classic thing of white men, or associated with white men in the US. But it's not. I mean, a lot of Latinos in my neighborhood also have a pickup truck, so it starts becoming more complicated. And then you can talk about what kinds of fantasies are linked to a pickup truck. So yeah.
Yeah, it becomes, and I'm definitely immediately thinking of the descent on Capitol Hill last year, and all the various accoutrements that we were seeing there, the flags, but also what people were wearing, and just the visual performance, but also particularly through the various objects that people were attaching to themselves, you know, as part of the siege on Capitol Hill. So, so yeah, much to think about there. Thank you. We are running out of time. We have a few more comments here that people can read in the comment section. Paulette Kutsia is asking us more of a grammar question, I think. We will mull it over, Paulette, and get back to you on that one. Nicholas Freeland talks there about that he feels that it's more important to surface whiteness in such spaces where whiteness is surfaced. He feels that they are safer spaces rather than colorblind spaces. And then he also says, anti-racist spaces where whiteness cannot be named. Well, I do think it depends on but you know, which anti-racist spaces you're talking about. Definitely in anti-racist spaces where I move, whiteness is particularly named. You know, that's part of the project of anti-racism. Then Melanie Judge, being safely white through violence, powerfully harrowing, she said. I think that's a comment on what Sherene was sharing with us. And Carol was also saying excellent points about rage and violence. Is there a last comment from your side, Shona? And then we'll have a comfort break before we launch into the next session.
Yeah. No, I always wish we had longer because things always take a while to get going. So I was wanting to kind of wrap up these different comments that the audience have made, actually, because I think they get to something important that we're circling around almost, and that I really wanted to put on the table and maybe didn't do it very well. But I think this question that was posed to Katalin, so why how do you respond to the criticism about the centering of whiteness in work about racialization? And then we've talked about this centering of whiteness. And for me, all of the papers are about whiteness. I think part of the trap that we end up in is that we imagine whiteness is attached to white bodies. And I think, so for me, I'm interested in the way that our conversations move through these issues. And I think that relates potentially to this issue of the on, of, or in, which I don't know whether it is just about grammar. I don't know, Paulette, but I read something very important into this issue of and the in for me is about the us and the we. And I didn't do prefacing of that very deliberately because this is about a racial formation, I think, or a global colonial formation. So, and then I think that relates to Nicholas's comments, but I know we haven't got time to unpack that now. But I think these are really important comments that are potentially bringing in aspects of a critique that make it very difficult for us to engage around the relationships that we're trying to prize apart. Maybe I should speak for me there rather than the we. Was that the royal we? I don't know. Anyway, thank you.
Thank you so much. I want to really thank our three authors here, Sherene, Razack, Arun Saldanha, and Katalin Halasz. Thank you so much for taking the time out to be with us today, and also for your wonderful chapters. You know, a handbook will not be without wonderful chapters by excellent and deeply thoughtful authors like yourselves. So thank you so much for your contributions. We really appreciate it. We will have another session now shortly after a comfort break. We'll have a comfort break of a few minutes, and the next session will be on the section that's called Ideological Conspiracies, where we're looking at particular ideological formations that buttress whiteness and reinforce whiteness. So we've got two of our authors joining us on that, Sitara Thobani and Kendra Marston. So please join us again. We'll take a comfort break of 5 minutes. So join us again in 5 minutes time, and we will proceed with that session.
Bye everyone. Thanks for the panel.
cup of something. Yeah, we've got Kendra here and Sitara. Yeah, there's Sitara, Kendra. Okay, great, wonderful. So yeah, so welcome back. We are now in the section of our event where we're moving to the second section in the book, which is called Ideological Conspiracies. And the idea there is where the title actually comes from is to make sense of conjunctions between whiteness and certain ideologies that work to reinforce whiteness and race generally. So the idea is to try and make sense. It's one of the approaches through which one can make sense of the durability of race as a construct, and of course of racism as an ideology in itself in relation to other ideologies, and how they get reproduced and perpetuated. These particular racial formations of which we are now studying whiteness as your central pillar. So we've got a wonderful range of authors that have contributed. Some of them will be with us later this week, but we are very lucky to have both Sitara Thobani and Kendra Marston joining us today. And particularly, of course, nationalism features quite strongly as an ideology through which whiteness is in a sense almost like a carrier ideology for whiteness. A number of our chapters actually address nationalism, and in the case both of Sitara and Kendra's chapters, we are looking actually at forms of nationalism in relation to particularly in Kendra's case, in relation to post-feminism, and yeah, so it's what I found particularly fascinating about Kendra's chapter. Kendra actually looks at the figure of Meghan Markle, and as we know, in fact, the whole drama around Meghan Markle and the royal family exploded. I think while we were, we were still busy with finalizing your chapter, and you were actually able to bring some of that in. People will recall the Oprah Winfrey interview and so forth. And what Kendra's analysis sort of delves into is how central femininity, a certain form of femininity, is still to white nationalism, and how the royal family acts as a symbol in relation to Britishness and to a kind of a resurgent white nationalism in Britain. And it links very nicely with Sitara's chapter, where Sitara actually finds completely, well, for me, when I read your chapter, Sitara, I mean, I was completely taken aback to see a kind of almost I won't say a marriage of convenience, but some kind of connection of convenience between two forms of nationalism. In this case, this resurgent white nationalism in the United States with Hindu nationalism, and both of these chapters and also some of the other chapters in this section actually speak to this resurgent white nationalism that we see, and we see it playing out in quite unexpected forms, which both these chapters shed light on. So without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Sitara, and then Shona will manage our timekeeping and so. But Sitara, very good to have you here with us, and looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you. Thank you very much both to Christi and Shona, and congratulations on seeing this work finally come into fruition. It is a very large and very impressive piece, and it's an absolute pleasure to be a part of it. Thank you to the other contributors as well. I'm really happy to be a part of the discussion today. And finally, to all of you working behind the scenes to pull off this very global event. It's all going very smoothly so far, touch wood. So thank you very much for all of that. My interest in this work really began during the 2015 primaries and subsequent US presidential elections, when a very small but vocal and very wealthy segment of the Indian diaspora was garnering media coverage for their mobilization in support of Donald Trump, first as kind of in the primaries to lead the Republican Party and then as presidential candidate. Now, this is a fairly conservative and not necessarily representative group that kind of representative of the wider diaspora. But I believe that studying them does open to a larger set of questions about diasporic identity, as well as diasporic political engagement for us to think about more generally. I'll save that for another time, but today I want to point out that this particular segment that I'm looking at is also very closely linked to the Indian Prime Minister, Narendra Modi, under whom there has been a significant and violent resurgence and deeper institutionalization of Hindu nationalism and its attendant Islamophobic discourses. So this is the global context. And as Christi was alluding to, these are the different nationalist politics that I'm looking at, kind of that represented by Donald Trump in the US and Narendra Modi in India. So the Hindu nationalism of these diasporic subjects, it seemed to me, made them this ideal catalyst for Trump's white supremacist agenda. Their long-distance nationalism links them to the Indian nation in a way that makes them non-threatening to the white supremacist visions of the United States that were being articulated and really kind of expanded upon more widely in 2015 and 2016, and then subsequently, of course. Now, long-distance nationalism is, of course, what scholars have described the kind of political engagement that you find in the diaspora, where people hold their links to the homeland in very strong ways. But what engagement with the US political scene, that these nationalists were gaining legitimacy for the idea of India as a Hindu nation. That is, Hindu nationalism is premised upon this equation between Indianness and Hinduness, and that was being legitimized through the activism that was being enacted kind of in direct relation to the US. And so this really complicates the idea of long distance nationalism, I argue, because it's not just holding on ties or loyalty to the homeland. It's really kind of gaining a particular kind of legitimacy for the politics in these receiving countries. Indeed, it was when I first heard Trump say, "I love the Hindus," that this whole project kind of sprang into being, because it became very difficult to imagine another group that could be identified in religious terms in this way. And I don't chalk that up just to kind of one of Trump's idiosyncratic ways of speaking, but I think it's a really loaded statement that this is how he is identifying this group when he says, "I love the Hindus." And so, again, in trying to really complicate the various strands of nationalist mobilization that was being revealed, it also became important to study how these activists, this group of the diaspora, were also advancing ideas of America as unequivocally white through their engagement as well. So they're playing multiple roles. And again, as Christi was saying, this idea of buttressing whiteness in a much larger context. This led me to really kind of my question kind of at the core of this work, which is to explore these dynamics wherein racialized subjects align with and advance white supremacist agendas historically and into the present. And again, I want to link to what Arun was saying in the first panel around thinking about history and temporality in a much more complicated way. It's not a linear history that I'm drawing, but still I'm arguing that there are other histories that are revealed when we take this approach to look at how the past is being invoked and kind of reproduced in the present in the ways that it is. And so this really led to my larger project, which is still very much a work in progress. And I appreciate the opportunity to submit my chapter because it does kind of help me think through this larger work. And that larger work is about historicizing this relationship in the global racial order. It's in this context that whiteness is produced alongside the religio-racial formations that underpin Hindu nationalism. And while both have shifted over time, they continue to do so in relation to one another. So I'm really interested in how do we trace a shifting history between shifting entities and still understand it in terms of kind of the global colonial context in which race is being produced and continues to be produced. It's for this reason that I find the diaspora to be especially a productive site to study, because the diaspora weaves together the history of coloniality in India with that of the diaspora settlement in places like the US. I think too often at the most basic level, we think of diasporas as a kind of rupture and look at it in kind of the context of where the diaspora has settled. And here what I see is the diaspora carrying through the history of colonialism in India into the present, in the American context in this case. So in other words, these diasporic subjects embody the very history of colonial racialization and its extension into the transnational present. The diaspora, I argue, thus has a lot to reveal about how contemporary race relations subtend the logic of coloniality into the present. So to turn very briefly to my chapter, to give a brief overview of what I try to do here, I begin with how diverse ethnic and religious identities were homogenized into the category Hindu through the process of migration. And what's really important here is that this happens both from within what becomes the diaspora, but also from outside as well. So I look at Supreme Court rulings and kind of legal categories of citizenship when citizenship was defined as related to whiteness, in order to see how this kind of homogeneous category of the Hindu is functioning. Again, keeping in mind the role that this homogeneous category Hindu plays in Hindu nationalist discourses, right? So it becomes another way of validating this generic identity that kind of is at the heart of Hindu nationalist historicization as well. And of course, it's through such citizenship laws that the racial borders of the US were also being secured, and that the US was situating itself in a global framework of whiteness, right? It's through these laws that the US makes itself as white, again, in a transnational context. So looking at once more the multiple projects that are advanced through this kind of new taxonomy that's being formed. Now, in the present, citizenship isn't necessarily as much a concern as in the past, due in part to the mobility and transnational connections of the subjects that I'm studying in the present, right? They're incredibly wealthy, have access to capital, and again, kind of are these transnational subjects, which complicates the story in a way. But I build on this history of US citizenship law to look at how the Indian American identity that comes to be produced is then taken up in the present, and paying attention to Hindu nationalist kind of activists on both sides of the political spectrum. That is kind of the Hindus for Trump that I described initially and sparking my initial interest in this work, but also Hindus decidedly not for Trump, kind of those who have really become very well versed in the language of social justice and would not necessarily identify with their counterparts on the right. So the first, the Hindus for Trump group is straight up kind of the idea of the model minority. They're very business oriented. They were behind the Hindus for Trump kind of platform and agenda. They're tied to the Republican Hindu Coalition, and they talk very kind of often about how the U.S. must secure its borders against terrorists in much the same way as India needs to as well. And so in their discourse, you see this kind of metaphorical mapping of India onto the US as if the two contexts are somewhat synonymous. And again, it reads to me, and I'm interested in developing this more further, not only kind of a shared enemy in the figure of the Muslim, but it's actually a mapping onto, in effect, kind of saying we're one and the same, in a way that I think signals that kind of psychoaffective desire for whiteness that Fanon spoke of, and that I begin my chapter with as well, right? This really powerful mapping onto the US context. The second group is what I call kind of the model critique of the model minority. This is the group that really does engage the language of social justice and is very comfortable kind of keeping up with popular discourses in the wake of Black Lives Matter, for example. They talk about settler colonialism and how the US is rooted in that history of genocide, but they do so in order to reframe Indian history as one in which kind of Muslims are the settler colonizers and the invaders. So again, coming back to very Hindu nationalist discourses and historical narratives. In this, Black Americans are once again rendered invisible. But also what I find is US domestic space is effectively being annexed into this global Hindu nationalist space. So again, we have this really interesting play with spatial locations, again, kind of due to this transnational context in which this is happening. But once more, kind of this question of how supremacist politics are being advanced, right? Ultimately here, in this case, in the service of a global Hindutva, a global Hindu nationalism. Yeah. So to summarize in conclusion, just finally,
perfect.
Although both sides do profess different positions in relation to the US domestic sphere, it's really looking at how both enact similar moves to secure the religio-racial boundaries of the Indian nation. And through this, the construction of US identity as inherently white, that was kind of a driving motivation for me in this work, and continues to be so. So thank you.
Yeah, it's so rich. You're bringing together so many things. It's always a challenge, isn't it? Kendra, would you like to come in, and then we can hopefully have a bit of a conversation?
Yeah, sure. So thanks, Shona and Christi, for the invitation to be part of this volume, and for your editing, because I think, yeah, the chapter was certainly a lot more refined after I'd had a few pairs of eyes looking over it, and thanks people for coming along. Yeah, so my chapter's on, it's entitled Hating Meghan Markle, Redrawing the Boundaries of British Whiteness Against Post-Feminist Femininity. And I was asked originally by Shona and Christi to contribute something on how post-feminism as an ideology and philosophy conspires to privilege whiteness. So my chapter is about the relationship between white nationalism and investments in the British monarchy as a symbol of empire and heritage whiteness, as framed through the backlash against Meghan Markle's inclusion in the royal family. So as the title indicates, the backlash against Meghan Markle is in part a backlash against post-feminism. So there's been some debate throughout the years that people have been writing on post-feminism about the actual term, but it's aligned with neoliberalism and has been defined by most as a kind of a cultural sensibility in which female empowerment is primarily framed through success on the terms of a consumer capitalist system. So it largely champions the successes of upwardly mobile middle-class women and defines this as feminist, often conflating feminism with leadership and framing it through a competitive individualistic logic. So many scholars have hypothesized that post-feminism privileges a Western white heterosexual subject, but as with post-racial logic, it does rely on some inclusion of people of color to prop up the ideology. So in a similar way to the idea that a Black woman in the royal family can supposedly help to launder its role in racist colonial systems and maintain its cultural power and symbolism, Black celebrities and the representation of, say, Black women in prestige television dramas as icons of post-feminist success, say Meghan Markle in Suits, does important ideological work in championing this idea of equality of opportunity. And she has talked about her role in the royal family in kind of similar terms, I think. So this framing works to deflect the history of the institution or what it means to represent an institution as well that has derived money from slavery, that was the figurehead for colonial expansion and subjugation of Indigenous peoples. So if we use Aotearoa New Zealand as an example, the removal of Māori sovereignty and land, the rejection of Māori value systems, decline of taonga, such as the language, and so on. So it's more of a representation matters approach where the structure remains intact, but anyone can rise to the top of the structure and represent it. However, this strategy didn't really work, in part due to this visceral reaction against her by the press, but also from members of the public that deemed her a misfit with their fantasy of what the monarchy should be, and the ideal of royal white womanhood as well, which is quite different from post-feminist femininity. It's quite a pre-feminist ideal, sort of domestic, benevolent, maternal, I think sort of consistent with the role of white female missionaries as well. So royal tours in New Zealand have, and probably everywhere where there are royal tours, have quite parental overtones still. So various charitable groups in New Zealand will kind of be trotted out to impress the royal family with what they've been doing and how they're working to make life better for the people of the Commonwealth. There's still very much this investment in the idea of the Commonwealth, with the royal family kind of operating as barometers of taste as to what constitutes worthwhile charitable endeavour. So I chose to analyse the backlash predominantly through the comments section of the Mail Online's Showbiz section. So the Mail Online is part of the Daily Mail, a tabloid that's very popular in Britain and internationally, and it's had its fair share of criticism for sensationalist and often racist reporting. And they went after Meghan Markle from the beginning, so claiming she came from a gang-scarred home in LA and it would be unsafe for Harry to visit her there, that she neglects her family, particularly the white members of her family, that she overspends on home renovations and fashion and so on. And these stories gathered steam and incensed the readership, leading these outlets to publish more and more about her. So one thing that I probably didn't get across enough in the chapter is that hating Meghan Markle is big business as well. So there are people on YouTube, for example, that who've set up accounts dedicated to hating Meghan Markle that would be pulling in probably millions in advertising revenue. So these stories on the Mail Online are commented on by Daily Mail readers, and articles about her attract a lot of comments. So there is kind of negative discourse around celebrity in the Daily Mail generally, but with Meghan Markle, it is different. So stories about her will often attract thousands of comments. And so they took on this effective energy that's quite unusual in its scale and intensity and relentlessness. And these comments are ranked by how popular they are with other readers. So the most popular comments on articles about Meghan Markle are always negative, and upvotes greatly outnumber downvotes. And this backlash sets up a dichotomy. So Meghan Markle as an individualistic, consumerist, failing Hollywood celebrity versus the monarchy as a public good. So obviously this idea that the monarchy is a public good makes for a false dichotomy. But one of the ways that the monarchy maintains its power is through its framing as a charitable entity. And this, for a lot of people, I think renders the monarchy's extreme wealth and its history acceptable, or even allows for a reread of that history. So I think the monarchy is part of this kind of white saviour industrial complex that other authors in this volume talk about. So Daily Mail commenters will often look at inequality as a matter of performance. So they kind of accept that it exists, but there are good elites and there are bad elites. And the good elites tend to be white, class privileged, and so on. And also the good elites won't engage in with politics that they don't like. I think that's important as well. So scholar Joe Littler has done some really interesting work on how the super rich will tend to present themselves as kind of middle class and relatable in order to maintain power too. So the normcore aristocrat, she calls it. So with the royal family, that might mean overplaying Kate Middleton's commoner background, or the fact that she wears clothes from the high street multiple times. And in the chapter, I talk about how performances of ordinariness and solidarity tend to be dialed up more in settings where accusations of gross inequality is likely to be more pronounced, or where their appearance somewhere might invite it more. But Littler also talked about the rich presenting themselves as kindly parents as well. And I think this is relevant to the myth of the monarchy as a public good and fits nicely with imperialist ideology. So there's this idea in the comment section that the Queen works so hard for us and we must protect her. And something I've thought about more recently, and it's not so much in the chapter, but this invocation of vulnerable white bodies that need to be protected. So the Queen is an elderly person, or Meghan Markle's father is a sick person. whom Meghan Markle threatens through her behaviour. So there's something there around how anxieties around the vulnerability of whiteness, and that can be national whiteness, play out through these characters who, in a way, they're kind of symbolic actors in a type of show, like a reality show. So while there is backlash against Meghan Markle as a post-feminist figure, I do think the saga also demonstrates how post-feminism conspires to privilege whiteness too, as the tools that male online commenters use to reject her and the rules that she is measured against are consistent with the workings of post-feminist neoliberal culture. Its emphasis on meritocracy, the deserving and the undeserving, and all of that. So there are constructions of Markle as an undeserving recipient of the British public's welfare. So there has been criticism of scholarship on post-feminism for how much it has centralised whiteness, I guess, in the writing. And one of these criticisms was that it would tend to focus on genres, so in terms of representation, that were whiter genres, so say like romantic comedies, at the expense of areas like music or reality television, as Jess Butler pointed out. And I think these commenters are kind of like reality television audiences, in the sense that celebrity in reality television, it's not guaranteed. It's something that you have to earn, and the audience is kind of empowered to decide whether or not you will be accepted into this particular sphere of the good elite in this case. So Meghan Markle is kind of read as a bad contestant, in the sense that she's seen to be motivated by fame over love or duty, which is a dichotomy that kind of plays out in things like dating shows and talent quests. Again, a threat to this idea of the monarchy as a public good, but also to the bloodline, in the sense that she constitutes a threat to the conservative family structure. And that's a race issue, but also her feminism as well. And I can also see a link to the makeover genre too now, in the sense that she's kind of positioned as an imitator or a plagiarist of charisma that's seen as white and special, and that she mimics it for sinister intent. So the royal family, you know, it is part of the makeover genre. We get these Cinderella stories, but here Meghan Markle is seen as a recipient of wrongful reward, not a deserving subject to be made over. So if senior royals position themselves as educators of how we all should be, then there's a rejection of her position within that framework, but importantly not a rejection of the actual framework itself, just who's allowed in it. So that's it.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Kendra. Sorry, I had to cut you off there. So look, we have, unsurprisingly, everybody slipped in terms of time. So what I'm going to do is I did message you, Christy, but I don't know whether you've I'm going to give us 20 more minutes so that we have got some time to discuss. We were supposed to close in 3. So I'm giving folks the opportunity that, I don't know if Sherene or Arun have to go and teach, or anybody who wants to kind of leave is welcome to, but it would be really nice if those of you that can could stay for, oh great, is Arun staying? Are you not good? If you could kind of stick around for a little while and just ask some questions of Sitara and Kendra and Christi, and then maybe we'll get some other minutes. But so I'm going to give us till 20 past, so that's even 22. Okay.
Great. Yeah, thanks, Shona. Because I've really enjoyed both of these chapters and also the inputs today, and would like to tease out a few more, or create more of an opportunity so that we can tease out more details from those chapters. So Sitara, if you could talk a little bit more about this mapping onto, using Fanon, how Hindus for Trump, because it sounds like what you're basically explaining is a kind of a mapping onto whiteness is that now, should one understand that then as a kind of a mapping of Hindu identity of this particular subjectivity now onto whiteness, and tell us a bit more about how that would work.
For me, the example that really brought this to life is one of the key figures in the Republican Hindu Coalition, writing in Breitbart, actually talks about the role that Indians, and of course he means very specific Indians, can play in educating Americans, or can contribute to Americans. And this is a line that gets picked up elsewhere in the Hindus for Trump platform, that these Hindu nationalists are particularly well poised to educate white America on how to deal with, quote unquote, kind of the brown Muslim threat. And the thing that he turns to is the border, comparing the border between India and Pakistan to that between between the US and Mexico. And again, in reading the writing, you can't help but kind of hear in the back of your mind kind of the chant of build that wall, build that wall. That trope has just become so overdetermined and so powerful an idea. And so to think of this idea of physical borders at kind of very different sides of the world still enacting something very, very similar in kind of demarcating spaces for people, for kind of actors in their physical locations, right? That all of a sudden for white America, the Indian-Pakistan border becomes kind of this very real thing because of their engagement with Trump's build that wall here. That's what I was referring to by that mapping onto. But I think that does open the door to ask about kind of that, the psychic and again, that affective, which Sherene was also talking about earlier, right? That the power that is created when you can hear that chant in your mind, when you can feel that, when you can feel kind of the threat, whether it is because of your perceptions around what's happening in the subcontinent or what's happening in North America, to make these positions very real. And so that mapping onto is my way of still trying to think through how do these actors really position themselves and see themselves in relation to US whiteness. And there is an element of, look, we are dealing with the same thing, but at the same time, there's a keen awareness that we're not the same, right? There's this also this attempt to, as I was saying before, to position themselves as, we can educate you, we can help you in this larger pursuit. And again, I think that opens up questions as well as to what that ultimate pursuit is. Is there kind of a whiteness that goes beyond the US in this sense that they're aspiring towards through this kind of offer of help?
Yeah, that's fascinating. And just another question from my side is also, because I'm seeing definitely already now, I just pointed to a resonance also with Sherene's paper earlier. And also in your chapter, you also referred to various court cases, and you were talking about, you know, the creation or this constant construction, you know, of America as white, or the true American subject as a white subject, and how the law is mobilized in that sense. Tell us a bit more about that.
Mm-hmm. I think that's very complicated because of the role that kind of the figure of the Asian migrant played in consolidating those categories, kind of ideas of American citizenship as well as American whiteness. And so the early court cases where you see Asians, I talk about Bhagat Singh Thind, specifically South Asian, trying to access American citizenship in really the only way that's available to them, and that is through the category, that this idea of being a Caucasian, building on Orientalist scholarship that saw kind of a kinship between South Asians and the Caucasian race kind of in the midst of time. But what we see with those citizenship laws is it's also a consolidation of racial identities and of whiteness, right? That we kind of mustn't lose sight of the role that the law plays in determining citizenship, the role that it plays in actually kind of constructing and solidifying ideas about race as well. And so I think that the migrant, the figure of the Asian, played a very complicated role because in an attempt to access this citizenship, that's all that they had at their disposal. So I think it's trying to complicate that history in order to understand how it comes to be solidified in the way that it does. And then, of course, my interest in looking at the law is how even then the law takes up this idea of the Hindu, the figure of the Hindu. And Bhagat Singh Thind himself was not Hindu, he was Sikh, but still operating on a very colonial idea of what the Hindu was as the signifier of absolute racial alterity, and then writing that into law as well, unwittingly, but still kind of working in tandem with a very different discourse in the context of colonial India, where the Hindu was being defined as kind of a racial figure as much as a religious figure. And that, of course, becomes the foundation of Hindu nationalism.
Yeah. I'm wondering if Sherene's question, I can see your hand, Sherene, relates, and then I want to try, let's see how that goes, and then I've got some questions, Kendra.
It's less of a question than a comment to Sitara. It's absolutely dizzying how many paths there are to whiteness and how quickly one could get booted out. So what is remarkable about the Trump attachment to Modi and to Hinduism is that, so the best path to whiteness that I can see right now, not the best, but one of the better ones, is to be anti-Muslim. If you can pull that off, you might get in for about 10 seconds. And what is sort of remarkable about the history is like when you think in the United States that to be from the Middle Eastern is still a category that's white. Legally. I mean, it's absolutely dizzying how one travels in and out of these categories at such a speed. And I just sort of wanted to comment on that, because I've personally gotten a lot of pushback from terrific friends and scholars who work on India, and I'm a North Americanist. But they basically say to me, it's completely wrong to understand the Indian situation in terms of whiteness. And I know, Sitara, you're understanding the diaspora, but the actual situation in India, what is that? Is that about whiteness? Well, I'm pretty definite that it is about race, because there are two orders of humanity that are being invoked. But what is its connection to whiteness? And I think that my friends who raise this question with me are raising a really legitimate question, that you can have race, you can have humanity and subhumanity, and it need not be about whiteness. But whiteness is such a global structure right now, it's hard to imagine any project of rule, any racial project of rule that isn't connected to it in the way that Sitara showed.
Yeah, that's brilliant, actually, Sherene. And I don't know whether you've seen Carol's question in the chat, and I am definitely bringing this round to Kendra in a moment because I can see some. But Carol has just asked a little while ago, are the Hindus for Trump really positioning themselves with whiteness? And I don't know, Carol, the detail of your question there, but my reading of that is partly about some of what Sherene and Sitara, obviously, with her chapter was kind of bringing out. I don't know. Oh, the great Arun, yeah. It's difficult to study Trump on the one hand or to witness Hindu nationalism destroying India's social fabric on the other, combining the, okay, I might not be able to think this one. Combining these two things, yeah, courage, yeah, great. Okay, maybe we'll come back to that in a moment. But I would really like to use a bit of what we've been talking about and use this discussion or the kind of positioning very early on, Sitara, that you were talking about. How did you put it? Diaspora is often understood as being about rupture, and you're you're doing something quite different here. And I was thinking also about really the set of relations that Kendra's talking about. So even though this is about Britishness or Meghan Markle and the relation to whiteness and all of that sort of stuff, I enjoyed the way that you positioned your piece, Kendra, in terms of New Zealand and the relation to that. And I wanted to just think a little bit, if you would, about the travelling of, and there's a couple of things. So the travellings I was talking about there, and the multiple travellings that we've been speaking about in different ways. But also, I'm really interested in the way that when you're sitting in the context of New Zealand or Australia or Canada or many, other settler colonies that are commonly imagined in the kind of public sphere to be, or in the mainstream public sphere, whatever that is, I don't know, the popular kind of imagination, to be white. How does that work? Can you speak to that a little bit more, really? Your analysis of Britishness from the context of New Zealand is the quick way to ask that, but there's lots of theoretical questions.
Yeah, well, I think, there's still very much an investment in the monarchy in New Zealand as well. So we get a lot of news stories about them, and certainly around Christmas time, we got a lot of media propaganda around how people in Britain were decorating their castles for Christmas and all this kind of thing. So I think that white identity in New Zealand is still very much connected to what it means to be white in Britain. And I think for a strong Republican sentiment to emerge, it would be perceived as potentially threatening a kind of ancestry connection to Britain. So I don't know if anyone hears too much about New Zealand, but we had a flag referendum a few years ago where there was ultimately it was voted to keep the Union Jack, that it really meant something to New Zealand. So, and also I think the history in our schools as well, just thinking about this continued investment in the monarchy, we're very much taught to think about the Treaty of Waitangi as an historical event, something that happened and was probably unfair, but is gone and is past. And now we have to work out how to figure out how to work together. So I think in order for that investment in British whiteness to be destabilised, I think that education on the settling of New Zealand would need to change in terms of how these kind of allegiances to the crown, but also European ways of doing things, contribute to the disparities we have around health and education in New Zealand. So yeah, there's a lot kind of going on there, but certainly there is a kind of a strong tie still to Britain.
And I think your example of the Daily Mail as somebody who's kind of situated here is really interesting in terms of the analysis you're drawing, because of course the Daily Mail, one of the things that we probably talk about less in the current context maybe, is they had a very big role in kind of bringing the Stephen Lawrence, the events of the killing of Stephen Lawrence kind of to trial, the bringing to trial of some of the people who were eventually found guilty a long while after that kind of campaign. But I think it's interesting because thinking then about the ways in which a publication like the Daily Mail positions liberal anti-racism, how that works in relation to, so the shifts, I suppose, in alliances and how they produce different formations of whiteness and how they're integral to those different formations of whiteness, but how those formations work together. And I think that was one of the things I was interested in relation to this question also of what is it to theorize British whiteness or to understand British whiteness from the context of New Zealand, really. And maybe if Mark Schmidt were here, I might be asking him some sort of question about the German context. But we've got many more comments now, Christi. And we'll do 4 more minutes, and I'll draw in the comments.
Yeah, I think it's a fascinating conversation so far, and it's definitely this question of kind of an identification with whiteness, or perhaps with strategies of whiteness, or the mobilization of strategies of whiteness, but by subjects that are racialized as other to whiteness. So it's something that I'm also grappling with in the African context. So and it's it comes up in the notion around what whiteness beyond white people, that whiteness as a power formation, organizes bodies in a particular kind of way. You might have identifications happening that are not necessarily where you see kind of attachment of bodies that you don't that you wouldn't associate with the usual kind of phenotypical and so forth kind of bodily presentation, or however you want to call it. So it is and I'm wondering if the whole question around subject formation and the formation of whiteness through consumption and what Arun was talking about earlier on, if that's not one way of also helping us to make sense. I like Sitara, what you are doing with in relation to a certain politics, around the wall and so forth. So where there's sort of physical formations being used, and I'm wondering about consumerist objects as well, also being used as ways to indicate a certain kind of status, but it's sort of read off the white script in a way. The status that's being acquired through these objects is actually read off a script that comes from whiteness. So it's quite difficult to get one's head around it. But I'd love to hear further thoughts from Sherene and Sitara on this, and then also Kendra, in terms of what you were presenting, I thought there was a very interesting link also with what Sherene was talking about earlier on, and this rage, the rage of whiteness, because the absolute explosion of aggression and animosity on those social media pages about Meghan Markle, and the kinds of it is hating. I mean, that's why the title of the chapter is exactly that. So and complete so it is that the constitution of the white self, through this extreme animus. So yeah, if maybe Sherene also wants to comment further on that. So.
Well, I think you can hear from Sitara more than me on that. I just want to say that I feel a bit uneasy when we talk about this increasing aggression on the part of white people, because I'm sort of thinking it's always there, and it constitutes the white subject forever and a day, So I'm wondering whether there's anything at all different about what is happening now, for example, than elsewhere. That's all. I feel very uneasy about that. Actually, as a historian in a former life, it makes me very uneasy to think, because my understanding of the white subject is that subject is constituted through these feelings.
Can I? Okay, so I'm dying to come in, because I really feel that. I think that's a really important point, Sherene. And isn't that related to the visibilizing, or what we are prepared to see, and where we are or hear or engage with, and what we are prepared, where we are prepared to locate it? So this notion of an increasing something is actually potentially about the reading, the relation that is being produced at, and how that is used, if that makes sense, or what it gets attached to. Does that make sense, what I'm kind of asking there? No, maybe not.
Well, Sitara will surely have something.
Well, I guess the point that I wanted to come in on is this idea of kind of whiteness beyond white people. And I think there's a really ironic tension there, that there is, but that still comes back to the white body in very specific ways. And so what I was thinking of, Christi, as you were talking, is what work does the Black person standing behind Trump at the rally do? Or I'm in Canada right now and seeing images of what's happening in Ottawa. There was, again, a South Asian man standing in the middle of a sea of white protesters who are currently taking over the Capitol. And so there's an irony that parallels kind of in a very different context, kind of work that's been done around colorblind casting, right? And what does that actually achieve? And the irony wherein having quote unquote racial others present does the work of amplifying the whiteness. So here we can see the activities of these people of color aspiring to and pointing to, gesturing towards something beyond kind of whiteness as white bodies or specific to white bodies, and yet simultaneously doing the work of really amplifying that whiteness still kind of the proper place of whiteness is in the white body, as we see in these images at these campaigns and rallies, I would argue.
Yeah, I think that speaks to in a much more eloquent way to partly what I was trying to draw out. So Arun, I'm going to do something a little bit unfair. I'm going to bring you in, but I'm going to read the comments that we've had, one of which was from you anyway, just so that they're in the conversation. And then I am literally going to give you the last word and say night night to everyone, or morning or what have you. And because we're now 9:20. So just going to read these, hand over to Arun to bring it all together before we say bye. So it's difficult, this was from Arun earlier, it's difficult enough to study Trump on the one hand or to witness Hindu nationalism destroying India's social fabric on the other. Combining these two themes requires courage and calmness. Glad you're doing it, Sitara. Then we've got, I agree with Sherene from Nicholas. I lived in, Nicholas, okay, so I'm going to read this. I lived in Japan and was struck by how prevalent a preoccupation with whiteness was. I felt more Black in Japan than at home in England or in other countries like Mexico, Italy and Israel. It seemed linked to Japanese nationalist ideology about homogeneity, which I think historically has been infused by the white supremacist European nation-making model. And we have actually got a Japanese Yasuko Takazawa coming tomorrow. Is that right, Christy? Is that the day? To talk about precisely this, maybe. Nicholas, I'm not sure how you're positioned there, kind of, so we'll leave that all there. Then we've got Carol, and then I'm handing over to Arun. And this is why I was pushing Carol, actually. Carol says, in relation to her earlier question around the Trump and the Hindu nationalism issue, thanks, I was wondering if it was to do with wealth. And I was wondering about the relation of capital to all of this. And we've kind of, that's been on the table, but I think it's relevant. Okay, so Arun, I don't know whether what you had to say had anything to do with those comments or whether just bring it on.
Yes, it does actually. And yes. when I was talking about, there's also an emotional labor that we do as academics in studying things that can be quite awful and nauseating and scary. So I was coming from that perspective. I get so angry when I read news about Hindutva and what is being done to history textbooks and everything, and of course sometimes it's really difficult to hear another crazy story about Trump. So combining the two, I was like, I could never do that. So, but I think my comment is really about this issue of when whiteness as a structure interpolates non-white bodies or bodies we consider non-white, and if we're interested in the contingency of the racial system that we have right now, we have to be open to the idea that whiteness might disappear as being the sort of the most desirable and the most sort of central and core of the system. Again, I was mentioning the rise of China, and of course there's going to be a lot of xenophobia about China. I mean, there is already plenty. Yes, there is anti-Black racism within Arab history a lot. There are various forms of sort of self-aggrandizing ideas of Persian the Persian civilization or nation state or language. The comment about Japan is very pertinent because yes, there's fascism in Japan, and so I think it's really important to think about whiteness as having infused all other kinds of nationalism, because the nation state specifically and ideas about race were conceived on the basis of white colonialism and capitalism, but it doesn't stop there. I mean, history goes on, capitalism goes on. Capitalism has been sort of, strengthened by going outside of the centrality of whiteness, and will continue to do so. Yes, there's caste as well within India, which is linked to skin color and links to the whitening through all sorts of ointments in China as well. So this is not to sort of relativize the violence and the way that whiteness and white populations have imposed themselves on the rest of the world, but it's really to sort of underscore that the structures change, and there's a lot of Latinos and Black people who've been sort of going to Trump, and because of the desirability of that white supremacist position for people who are otherwise adversely affected by it. So yes, so I'm quite interested in that as well, and I think it's all about whiteness is not going to die by itself. Its demise is going to actually be very violent. So
yeah.
Great. Well, thanks, Arun. Maybe I can just make a final point here around in terms of I think what I was trying to say earlier around increasing aggression or so sort of relates more to what I was saying in my opening statements around the form that white supremacism is taking. And we've got a chapter in the book written by Cheryl Matthias and Colleen Boucher, where they talk about emboldening whiteness. So they're trying to get, and I'm trying to get a sort of a grip on what one is seeing as most crudely put, a white backlash. But so it's not to deny that whiteness hasn't always been violent. I mean, whiteness is I think constituted, as you say, through violence, Sherene. But there's one is seeing kind of a shift now away from the kind of liberal and neoliberal forms of whiteness, more to this kind of what would seem a more kind of a reversion to a particular kind of aggressive. Well, it's partly defensive, but it's acting with increased aggression. But it seems a throwback to a colonial whiteness, to my mind. So it's just trying to get a grip on how do we explain the Trumpist whiteness, or the white nationalist whiteness, the radical right whiteness that's coming up at the moment.
Well, I'd love to say more, but I shan't. Look, it's been, I wish we had another day and we could all stay awake or whatever, not do the things we have to do. But just thank you for our contributors for kind of being here. Thank you, Kendra, for getting up at, I don't know what time you had to get up in order to be looking fresh-faced to join us. Yeah, I love the claps. Thanks. Yeah, just really nice from my point of view. I don't know how you feel, Christi, I'm speaking for you, but from my point of view, it's just nice to meet many of you. I mean, some of you we know, others of you we don't, and just really lovely, and thank you so much. So folks who've been here today, really encourage you to, if you can, just drop into whichever of the other events you can, particularly given that hopefully the momentum of the conversation will gather in a way, although it feels like we've already got a lot to gather anyway. Yeah, I think I'm just going to leave it there. The other thing I did want to do was a shout out to Shefali Chandra, who also may not be able to join us because of the US teaching timetable situation. But she is also writing about caste in the book, actually using a particular text also. So Aaron, I don't, but anyway, so and her chapter touches a lot of the things we've been talking about. Okay, I think over and out then, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thank you from our side also. Thank you to our authors and to our audience. See you tomorrow.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
All right.